Good evening, everybody. My name is Greg Ranieri. I'm the Director of Health and Wellness for Scituate Public Schools, and we take this as an opportunity. The junior prom night is our informational night, is an opportunity to share back some valuable information that we collect in our health classes with students and families. Tonight, supporting me, I want to thank our student presenters tonight is Abby. Abby, if you could just give a wave to the crowd. You guys know funny faces at us tonight. It's really hard to do this, so we're putting ourselves out there, and these guys have been practicing with me for a few days. So Colleen, Emily, Amanda, and Aiden. So we just want to share with you what our goals are for our portion of the presentation, and then segueing into Dr. Harris's portion of the presentation. We want to share with you some trends that we've been collecting since 2011 with respect to our youth risk behavior data, specifically related to alcohol, marijuana, and some substances and perception of risk and harm. We want to discuss positive trends that we've noticed since we started collecting this information. We want to discuss some concerning trends, how we compare to the state, so how Scituate compares to the state. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Harris, will be touching upon harms associated with substance use, and specifically alcohol and marijuana with a teenage brain, the short and long-term risks of use, and we want to share some information through the FACTS Coalition and some resources that we have at the back, what parents can and should do to support their children and the community as a whole. I do want to hand it over very quickly to Officer Arsenault. She's gonna. There you go.
Hi, everybody. I'm Officer Arsenault. I obviously work for the Scituate Police. I don't just wear this costume. And I'm also the school resource officer. I work in all the schools, but primarily the high school. I have an office located here, and I have a vested interest in all of you people. I love what I do with you. I just wanted to go over some quick obvious laws with you as a precursor to prom, because not that this would be an issue, but in case it could be an issue. Obviously, the drinking age in Massachusetts is 21, right? Everyone knows that, okay? So not just to purchase or possess, but to consume. And so you could be charged with possession of alcohol just by merely possessing it within your body. So there are a whole host of things we could charge you with, which would destroy your life with criminal charges. So the best option is to choose not to drink. Right, Anne-Marie? Absolutely.
Destroy your life.
Make a bad choice. How about that? We don't want you to make bad choices. No, I'm the scary one tonight. Let me be scary. Bad cop. You can be good cop. Okay. Not to be a downer, but I do want to say this. I've been a police officer for 16 years, and the very worst days of my career have been holding teenagers as they die due to alcohol-related injuries or accidents, specifically car accidents, where they think someone's okay to drive, but they're too drunk to understand that that person's not okay to drive, and they get in the car. And I've had to hold those babies as they died in the street, and then knock on the door and tell their parents that their child is no longer with us. I get teary just thinking about it, because specific kids come to my mind when I think of that. So I don't want that to be any of you, because I care about you all. Man, now I'm not bad cop anymore. Bad cops can't cry. I know, sad cop. Okay, so to possess alcohol under the age of 21, you have a license suspension for 180 days and a fine of $300. A minor in possession or carrying alcohol in your vehicle, even if everyone in the car is sober, but you just have that alcohol in your vehicle, there's a penalty of a $50 fine for your first offense, $150 fine for your second offense, and subsequent after that gets higher, and license suspension for 90 days. So I also want to address some of the parents in the crowd and remind everybody what the social host laws are. Social host laws is something that we take very seriously in Scituate. Social host law pertains to anyone who has children in their home that are under the age of 21 and knowingly or unknowingly allows them to drink alcohol in their home. So we have some parents say, well, I didn't know they were drinking in the basement. I just let them be down there, and I didn't know they were all down there drinking. As a parent, you are responsible for what anyone in your home does, and you can be held criminally responsible for such actions. So if the police were to come to your home, you will 100% be charged with social host law crimes. So that's something that we take very seriously. And that's to protect all the youth in our beautiful town of Scituate. Any questions for me about any of that? Make good choices. Okay, happy promming.
We're on an upswing here. We're gonna turn the vibe right now, okay? So what I want to do is I want to hand it over to Aiden. Aiden is going to take the first portion to give you some information about some current trends, positive trends that we've had with our substance statistics.
So some positive trends that we're going to look at tonight, mostly in recency, are the use of drinking and marijuana use at SHS in the past 30 days. So drinking is down 22%, so from 50% in 2012 to 39% 2017. And then binge drinking is down 28% from 38% 2012 to 27% in 2017. And marijuana use is down 34% from 35% in 2012 and 23% in 2017.
So I just want to qualify what he said with respect to the past 30 days. It's not like 30 days back from today. It's from when students engaged with the survey. So we survey our students, a quarter of the population, every quarter, because every student takes a quarter of health during the course of the school year. So it's within 30 days of when the student took the survey. If they took it in November, it would have been October to November. If they took it in May, it would be April to May, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Excellent.
And so, although any use of drug is a concern, the use of the following drugs are not common at SHS. So 94% of SHS students have never ever used cocaine. 98% of SHS students have never used heroin, and 94% of SHS students have never used a prescription drug that was not of their own. And so the two main substances that teens use are alcohol and marijuana. So we want to take a look at those tonight and show you what they can do to you and how we relate to the state in this topic. And Colleen.
Thank you, Aiden.
So this graph shows a representation of the alcohol usage of SHS students over time. The blue line represents ever using alcohol, the red line represents used alcohol in the last 30 days, and the green line represents binge drinking in the last 30 days. And to define binge drinking, it's 5 or more drinks in a row within a couple of hours. So the alcohol use in total of SHS students has decreased in recent years and then kind of plateaued to like a low rate in 2017.
Just giving time for people to process.
And then marijuana usage in SHS students over time. The blue line is ever used marijuana and the red line is used marijuana in the past 30 days. So again, it's kind of a decrease, increase, and then back down again to pretty low rates in 2017. But marijuana use rates are now in line, like the Scituate rates are in line with the Massachusetts averages, and 68% of SHS students have never tried marijuana. So looking at those two graphs, it is some concerning data. There are high rates of regular marijuana usage among our juniors and seniors. And for the alcohol graph, the Scituate average is lower than that of Massachusetts, but the frequency and intensity and drunk driving is higher than the Massachusetts rate.
So now that we're all juniors, we have a lot of new experiences in our lives right now, including we're all just getting our driver's licenses, which means we have a lot less parental supervision. We have a lot more friends that use substances, and then also there's a lot of increased pressures, mainly academically, with looking at colleges and stuff. And all these things are going to factor into substance use and an increased risk of it. So this is the graph, or the percentage of students who have used alcohol in the past month. At SHS, about 39% of students have used it in the past month, which is that's it's going down, which is good, but it's still 5% more than the state average, which is 34%.
So you'll see that it's like 14, 37, 50, and 56. The weighted average of the people taking those is 39%, right? So it's not 39% of freshmen or seniors. That's the average, mean.
And then this is the graph of the percentage of students who've used marijuana in the past month. And the percentage used to be 43% at SHS, but now it's gone down to 23%, which is really good. And it's finally 2% lower than the state average, which is 21%, but or 25%, but it's still higher than the national average, which is 21%. And that is everybody.
Okay, so when we do drink, we have a tendency for higher intensity and higher risk behaviors. So although a smaller percent of Scituate High School students have ever used alcohol versus Massachusetts, more high school students drank in the last 30 days and binge drank than the Massachusetts average. So we see like that even though like half of them don't drink, when the other half, when they do it at a more intense rate. So drinking and driving is also like a big concern. So in Scituate, we do get in a car with a driver who's been drinking more than the Massachusetts rate, and that usually is a person under the age of 21. But when we drink and drive, we're at a lower rate than the Massachusetts statistics, and that has been, this is the first time that it's been lower than the Massachusetts rate, which is good because we're making progress in that.
The 6 years we've collected the data, this is the first time that statistical measure is actually below the state average, which is something to be, it's progress. Oftentimes we'll be asked too, like, okay, we drove in a car with someone who's been drinking, who is it? We then ask, like, who is it? The typical responses or top responses are friend under the age of 21, and the second most popular response was a parent or guardian.
So compared to the nation, Massachusetts is the same rate of the people who binge drank, but in Scituate we are at a higher rate, 27%, and so that just shows that Scituate does a lot more binge drinking than the rest of the nation. Okay, so among the 27% students who binge drink, 21% also drink and drive. So that's a really concerning statistic because there's only like 6% who don't drink and drive when they binge drink.
Yeah, 7% of the people that reported drinking reported driving. That basically increases by 300% people that binge drink. So people that binge drink drive at a 300% more rate than people that just drink casually. If that makes sense.
Thanks, Amanda.
Okay, so as some of these statistics may be a bit startling for parents, the good news is that the role of parents is actually pretty crucial in whether or not your child uses alcohol and marijuana. So from these graphs, you can see on the left side, it's students who perceive little or no parental disapproval, and you can see that 58% of them do not regularly consume alcohol, while 42% do. And on the right side, of students who perceive a high disapproval, 8% regularly do, and 92% don't. Yep. And then in this graph, you can see that the disapproval rate and the usage rate are highly correlated. So as the years go on and parental disapproval goes down, the usage goes up, like at the pretty much like the same, like, but opposite. So like you can see like the high correlation between the two.
Yeah, so the
for alcohol.
Perceived parent disapproval and actual use has an inverse relationship. that make sense?
Yeah.
So sorry.
No, that makes so much more sense.
Yeah, take this. You got this.
Yeah. And then this is pretty much like the same trend, except this is for marijuana use. So as the years go on and the disapproval goes down, the usage goes up. And it's an inverse relationship.
Simon, I have to be proud, right? That's not great.
No.
So to bring things home a little bit, I think they did awesome. No doubt. So research shows that when parents talk to teens about alcohol use and drug use or the risks associated with, have that open dialogue with their students, they're 50 to 50% less likely to use substances. So within the past 30 days, 44% of students have discussed underage drinking with their parents. 38% of students have discussed rules about drinking with their parents. Now these seem low. I mean, less than 50% of the kids are having these open conversations with their parents, but the good thing is this is trending up, right? So through our collective efforts through the FACTS Coalition and community-wide efforts, the conversations are the important conversations about having clear and high expectations with families, within families, parents and children, are increasing. Takeaway parents, you know, so this is messy stuff. It gets a little like funky, like how do I talk to my kids about this stuff? Don't assume they know how you feel. And oftentimes, unless it's expressly and clearly stated, your lack of expressed disapproval might be interpreted as likely as approval by teens, in which we saw that the inverse relationship with perceived disapproval and actual use. We've got some awesome takeaways at the back table with respect to handouts. On our Scituate FACTS website, there is a really neat resource about having a safe and substance-free prom season. That's a great resource for families as well. FACTS giveaways at the back. Yep, goodie bags. Feel free to follow us on Twitter, any social media as well. Pretty powerful presence at Scituate FACTS Coalition. And without further ado, let's give out. Yeah, I like that. That's good. That's good energy. I want to hand it over to Dr. Harris.
Good evening, everyone. So it's a great pleasure to be here in Scituate. I am an Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. I'm at Boston Children's Hospital in the Division of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine. I'm also the mom of a junior who is going to the prom. So I'm kind of going through what you guys are going through. It's very exciting. Just a little bit about myself. So I made my career studying, doing research in adolescent health. And the reason I chose adolescent health, so my PhD is in public health, is that when I thought about what would make a difference in the world, I thought, you know, adolescence is a really crucial transition time into adulthood. And so, you know, adolescents, you are the future of our world. And that, you know, to make a difference, I felt that it would be important to support adolescents growing, you know, healthy through and surviving adolescence actually, and becoming, you know, the healthy, happy, you know, self-supporting adults that you want to be. And so that's how I ended up in adolescent health. And so what I want to do today is update you on the latest and greatest science about specifically what's going on in the teen brain. So you may have heard some of this information, but what I thought might be useful is you've heard a lot about why substance use is bad for adolescents. I mean, that was that came across in the prior presentation. But I thought that it might be useful to understand what the science says about it. It's just so that you can get a sense of where that's coming from. Why is the drinking age 21? And we'll have legal recreational marijuana. Why is the minimum age 21? And hopefully what I'm going to be presenting to you will give you a sense of why. Okay? So I'm going to start with just getting a sense of what you already know about the brain. A little high school quiz show, okay? So let's see if you know the answer to this question. So the human brain weighs about the same as a jelly-filled donut, a football, or a chihuahua. Okay, so how many the jelly-filled donut? Raise your hand. I'm gonna go retro and just get your hand raised. Okay, how many say football? Okay, more. How many say chihuahua? The chihuahuas have it. Pretty good. There's at least half the room thought it was a chihuahua. Okay. So the typical chihuahua is about 3 pounds, and it's the weight of the brain that had us think that the teen brain was basically done developing, okay? So let's look at the data from which scientists made that conclusion. Okay, so I'm going to be making you kind of use those skills that you learned in science around, and math, I'm sure, around how to look at data, okay? So here's a chart that was published in a paper from the 1970s, way back. This is the weight of the brain in kilograms, and this is the age of the individual. And they had, several thousand brains. These were brains from cadavers, because the only way at the time that they could really look at the brain was actually outside of the body, like taking them and putting them on scales. So if you look at this, this chart, you'll see that there's this rapid growth in the size of the brain, and then it kind of plateaus. And so it's at about age 10 to 12 that it seems like the weight of the brain kind of flattens off, okay? For those of us that are adults, there is some bad news, which is that the brain does shrink as we get older. So, bummer. So anyway, so that's why scientists thought, well, the brain's pretty much done by, age 12. By the way, so anybody wondering why we have blue bars and red bars? So one actually stands for females and one stands for males. So how many of you, raise your hand, think the blue bars stand for females? Or is the brain size of females? Raise your hand. I would say the majority of you. And then how many think the blue is for males? Raise your hand. Okay. So males tend to have slightly heavier brains. And that's related to bigger size, physical size, okay? Males do tend to be bigger overall, physically, and that's seems to be correlating with the brain size. However, I think we all know that that doesn't correlate necessarily with intelligence. Sorry. Okay. All right. So, moving on from this. So, as I said, until the 1990s, brain development was thought to be complete by age 10 to age 12. But since then, with brain imaging using computers and MRI scanners, we now know so much more. We can study the living brain. And we're living in the age of the brain, because what we're learning about the brain, we're just exponentially increasing. So what we now know, and you've probably heard this already, that adolescence is a critical period in brain development, and that the brain develops until the mid-20s, okay? And I want to specifically highlight these two words, critical period, because they have a specific definition in neuroscience. They mean a particular thing in neuroscience. So a critical period, it refers to a window in brain development when a part of the brain develops rapidly and is highly sensitive to being shaped by environmental exposures and experiences. So that's what it means by a critical period. And so during these critical periods, brain development is really surging. And that is a function of both your DNA, sort of what you're preloaded with, and your experiences and exposures, okay? So I'm going to now unpack what we mean by brain development during the adolescent years. Specifically, there are two key processes that are occurring through the adolescent years and are, by the way, how many of you have a teen brain? Can you raise your hand? Okay, so this is going on in your brain as we speak, and it will continue for several more years. So there's a process called pruning and a process called myelination, okay? And I'm gonna specifically define what those are. And in order to do that, I have to give you a ridiculously brief guide to the brain. Okay, so bear with me. So I'm gonna specifically focus on neurons. So neurons are, you've probably heard, those are the main working cell of the brain. This is what they look like. This is under an electron microscope, and you can see these are all individual neurons. They have this cell body, and then they've got all these branching out, these arms that branch out and reach out to other neurons. So the basic structure of the neuron, so this is the body of the cell, okay? And then it's got these like spikes, like having spiky hair. They're called dendrites. You don't have to know these terms exactly, but, and then there's this long arm coming off of the cell body. It's called the axon. That's where the electrical signal travels down. And then there's this arm reaches out to the next neuron, and there's a connection here called the synapse. And this is just blowing up that synapse to show that that axon doesn't actually touch the next neuron. There's a little bit of space across which what we call a neurotransmitter travels, and that's a chemical. And so that gets released when there's an electrical signal coming down that axon, and that prompts the next neuron to do something, which is to activate. So now around age 12, so remember that brain weight chart. So up until about age 12, you get this really, massive growth of neurons. That's how you go from a little baby's head to the size of your head now. So your brain is really growing in the number of neurons. But then around age 12, neurons start to undergo pruning back based on the rule of use it or lose it. Meaning that the connections that are used are kept and strengthened, but then the connections that are not used get pruned away, all right? And this is one of the reasons why it's harder to learn a second language after the age of 12. Because before the age of 12, you've got more connections for that language to get imprinted in your brain. But after the age of 12, you start to have those connections get pruned away if they haven't already gotten imprinted. So this is just to illustrate. So at birth, we don't have that many neurons. And then during childhood, we have this, real like blossoming of all these neurons. And then you start to see a thinning back, okay? So now after pruning, when a particular brain area is rapidly going through this development, myelin starts to cover axons, those arms coming off of the cell bodies of the neurons. And myelin starts to thicken, okay? So myelin, what is myelin? So myelin is a fatty white substance that starts to cover over those axons, and it acts like insulation on an electrical wire. So remember that neurons are sending signals electrically, and so that white stuff helps to really insulate that axon. So it helps neuron signals, those electrical signals, travel much more quickly, up to 100 times faster. So this is really making your brain much more speedy in its ability to have signaling. So this is somebody's actual brain that was imaged in a scanner. And my husband's a neuroscientist, and so he gave me this image, and it stripped away other parts of the brain just so you could see myelinated axons. These are the longer ones that connect the front of the brain with the back of the brain and the two hemispheres, okay? And these are, as I said, myelinated, so they are now called white matter. So there's gray matter, which are the unmyelinated neurons, and white matter, which are the myelinated neurons, okay? And I call this the brain's information superhighway, because with the myelination, now the communication along those white matter tracks can travel much more quickly. And it really looks like a highway, right? So all of those myelinated neurons essentially make up the brain's connectome. So this is a real hot topic in neuroscience today, the connectome, which is the wiring up of the brain. And what we're finding out in today's brain science is how important the connectome is, or the proper wiring up of the brain to brain function. So there are a lot of brain disorders like epilepsy, autism, schizophrenia that we're finding have some underlying issues around the brain wiring, that the brain wiring isn't, is challenged. So this is, now we can see in greater detail than ever before this brain wiring connectome. So this is a great video illustrating what is going on in the brain between age 5 and 20 in terms of the gray matter turning into white matter. So let me just show you. See that? So you could see just how significant that change is, and it's going into the 20s. So even here, so the more blue and purple, the more white matter and less gray matter. And there's still parts of the brain, this is the front of the brain and the back of the brain. There are still parts of the brain in the front that have still some maturation to go. And this is even at age 20, which is why we think brain development continues into the mid-20s, okay? So, result when pruning and myelination are complete are faster but fewer connections in the brain. So why does the brain do this? Well, it's like speeding up the commute. So this is my commute from home to work, and you know, you can see the different routes, and I definitely want to go the fastest route. I don't want to go all the local roads. I want to get on the highway and get to my workplace as soon as I can. And that's what the brain is doing. It's trying to get rid of all the local roads that it doesn't need to create the most, you know, speedy, efficient brain that you can have. And why is that important? Well, because a lot of what we do, behavior, thought, whatever, requires different parts of the brain to work together. And in order for different parts of the brain to work together, those parts have to be able to communicate with each other well, like synchronize different parts of the brain. Particularly, as we mature, there's the part of the brain which is called the prefrontal cortex. How many of you have heard of the prefrontal cortex? Okay, so you probably then have heard that this kind of operates like the CEO of our brain. It's what helps us to do those kinds of higher order executive functions, like be able to organize ourselves, work towards a goal, impulse control, decision making, that kind of thing. Well, so in order for that part of the brain to work quickly so that we can, you know, make good choices in the moment, inhibit impulses, say, you know, not blurt out something that we will regret later, that kind of thing, that part of the brain has to be well connected up with other parts of the brain, say like the ones involved in emotion or pleasure, you know, because we want to be able to think about when something is appropriate versus not in terms of behavior. That's what's getting connected up through adolescence into adulthood. So it helps us to go from this to being able to do that. It's like, okay, I don't think this is such a great idea for me, because now our prefrontal cortex is really able to exert the control that we want. It's also, this wiring up in adolescence, is what helps us to become much more speedy in our coordination and reflexes, to go from that to being able to do that. Okay, adolescence is a great time to work on something. So because the teen brain is highly neuroplastic, meaning it's still very much able to change quickly, it's a double-edged sword. It's a time of both opportunity and vulnerability. So it's a time of opportunity because, as I said, you all can learn things much more quickly than, somebody my age or your parents' age. It's a great time for getting good at something. So whether it's, really working on an instrument or a sport, whatever it is, this is the time to work on it. Because with some practice, you're going to get really good much more quickly. And then you'll have these skills for the rest of your life. Okay? So this is a good time to learn something. And this is just to show, the Olympic women's hockey team that won the gold. A lot of them were adolescents and young adults. A lot of those who won medals at the Olympics were adolescents and young adults who spent a lot of time getting good at what they were working on, right? So, on the flip side though, the teen brain is more vulnerable then to being harmed by alcohol and drugs compared to the adult brain because of that neuroplasticity. So let me tell you more about why that is. So teen young adult brains, it turns out, respond differently to alcohol and drugs than adult brains. So let's look at the science, first on alcohol. So what I'm going to present to you, these are animal studies. And we have to use the animals because it's not ethical, obviously, to give you all just a ton of alcohol and see what happens. You could do that on your own, obviously, but we can't do that as scientists. As scientists, that's unethical. And plus, we want to be able to, really look at specific conditions, and that's much harder to do with human studies. So, all right. So these studies, one set of studies that I'm going to talk about, they used rats, and rats actually have brains that have some parts of the brain that are very similar to humans. And they found that adolescent rats were actually less sensitive than adult rats to the effects of alcohol and drugs in terms of sedation or sleepiness and motor impairment. Okay, so let me tell you what exactly that came from. Okay, so this experiment was conducted by a colleague of mine at Harvard, and she said this was the most boring science experiment she's ever done, or anybody could do, but it was so important. So what she did was she took rats of different ages, from adolescence all the way to adulthood, and she gave these rats different concentrations of alcohol. And then she, and when they're sedated, she would put them on their back, and as soon as they were awake enough, they would flip over because they hate being on their back. So what she did was she had to just sit there and time how soon the rat came out of its stupor, okay, and flipped over. And that was a way of looking at the sedating effect of alcohol. What was just remarkable, though, was these are adolescent rats here, these are adult rats here. This is the amount of time that went by for them to flip over. The adolescent rats, first of all, it took them much less time to flip over, and it didn't seem that an increase in concentration of alcohol really made that much of a difference compared to adult rats where, with greater alcohol, it took them a lot longer to get out of that sleep state. So that was really, really interesting that there seemed to be this, lower sensitivity to the sedating effect of alcohol. This next set of studies use something called the water maze. And this is a pool of water where there's a hidden platform. And so scientists would plop a rat in. And what the rat had to do was basically swim to find that hidden platform. Rats hate to swim, so they wanted to find some place to stand so that they didn't have to swim. And what this measures is both motor activity, how fast they swam, and how long it took them to find that platform. Okay, so and that's a test of memory and learning. So if they can't learn that well, it's going to take them a lot longer to find the platform because they might check one part of the pool and then they check another part of the pool, and if they forgot that they had already checked that other part, they would go back, right? And it would just take them longer to find that platform. So here's what they found. First, in terms of alcohol and swim speed. They found that adolescent rats swam just as fast on alcohol as saline, okay? But they found adult rats swam much slower. So in terms of motor activity, it seemed like the alcohol didn't affect adolescents as much as adults. Now, so this is what might happen if adults might drink, a fair amount. And here's the implication for adolescents drinking that same amount, but not as physically affected in terms of their motor activity. However, here's what happened in terms of actually the memory and cognitive performance. So among rats that were given saline, they were the control rats. So here's just the path that one rat took. So what they did was, here was the old platform location, and then the rat learned where the platform was, and then they switched it up. They took that platform and put it somewhere else. And now the rat had to figure out where it went, okay? So here's, they kind of swam over to where they thought it was, and then they realized it wasn't there, and then they moved off and went in search of it elsewhere, and they found it over here. Here's what happened with adolescent rats that were given a binge amount of alcohol. So they kept going back over to the place where it used to be, they couldn't learn as quickly that it was not there anymore. So clearly it was impacting their cognitive performance, their ability to learn, even though they were still swimming just as fast. So this is potentially why we see these kinds of things happening. As said earlier, motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of death for adolescents, and alcohol is a major contributor. And this young man who thought he was not drunk offered to drive these two young ladies home. This was in Norwell, and crashed the car. And just such a tragedy. And just, it's so heartbreaking for me how often we see these stories. This 20-year-old dies following an apparent fall after Amherst party. A Weston young man who died at college, drinking before he fell. So, potentially this is why young people can drink a lot more, and then potentially get into trouble, injured because of their ability to drink a lot more before they realize that they should stop or that they realize that they're impaired. Okay, so another way that the teen young adult brain is different from adults is they seem to respond differently to rewarding things. So I'm going to talk about this part of the brain in the middle. These highlighted areas in these color blobs, those are parts of the brain that have been found to really change during adolescence. So right in there is something called the reward pathway. How many of you have heard of the reward pathway? Sort of? Yeah, a little bit? So this is the part of the brain that's involved in our feeling pleasure when we're doing things that, have us want to do it over and over again. So when we eat good food, when we are hanging out with good friends, those things that we find pleasurable, this is the part of the brain that's activated. It's the reward circuitry. Well, it turns out that every single addictive substance activates this part of the brain, the reward circuit. And that's one of the reasons that's one of the reasons we feel the high associated with these substances, but also this part of the brain can get hijacked and make us want to do that drug over and over again to be able to feel that experience. So now, in terms of comparing adolescents and adults, in terms of that part of the brain, this study had people, humans now, going into the MRI scanner and playing a game where they could earn small, medium, or large rewards, money, okay? So this was designed to activate the reward pathway so that you could see how much it activates in people at different ages. So here's what they found. They found that adolescent brains showed a much stronger response to larger rewards than children or adults. So that teen brains seemed to respond more strongly to highly stimulating activities compared to adults. For example, like that, or that, or these, which are all highly stimulating. So it seems like the adolescent brain is really operating differently in response to these things than adults or children. So in terms of summary, teen brains have greater physical tolerance to alcohol and drugs. By the way, these same patterns were found with marijuana too, actually, as well as alcohol. Teen brains seem to show stronger reward response to addictive substances, so they tend to binge when using, and they change faster in response to addictive substances. That is, the teen brain, because it's so highly neuroplastic, tends to get addicted faster. And this is to show, this is from national survey data that asked adults when they first started to drink alcohol, and then also asked them questions to see if they met criteria for an alcohol use disorder. And you can see that the younger they started to drink, the more likely they actually had a problem with alcohol. This is the same pattern for every single substance: marijuana, prescription painkillers, everything. So it's something about how the teen brain is that puts it at greater risk. And then I want to quickly talk about how alcohol and drugs affect teen memory and thinking. So this part of the brain is called the hippocampus, and I call it the key to the SATs because it's the command center for memory, for creating memory in the brain. So it's key to learning. So it turns out the hippocampus is particularly sensitive to alcohol and marijuana, the effects of alcohol and marijuana. So this is, again, in rats, where they exposed rats to either saline or binge drinking amounts of alcohol. This is the control, these are neurons in the hippocampus among the control rats and alcohol rats. And you can see that this is a neuron. There's lots of these branches in neurons in the control rats, whereas there aren't as many in those that were exposed to binge drinking. And you want those branches because in order for the brain to make memory, to create long-term memory, it needs to actually implant those in the brain through connections. So you want more connections for those neurons. And this is measuring the size of the hippocampus among a sample of teens who have used alcohol heavily versus healthy control teens. And there was a clear difference in the size. So the hippocampus was 10 to 35% smaller among the heavy drinking teens. So in terms of marijuana, the main psychoactive chemical is THC. I think we've heard of that. There's a whole bunch of other chemicals, but I just want to focus on THC because that is what causes the effects, the main effects in marijuana. So it turns out that THC, it suppresses the activity of hippocampal cells below the level needed to trigger memory formation. So you need to activate hippocampal cells to be able to form those memories. Well, THC kind of dampens them down. So this is why it's, people can get that short-term memory loss when they're using THC. With chronic THC exposure during adolescence, however, neuron connections that are involved in memory get gradually suppressed and then lost. I mean, they're continually suppressed, and so they're gradually lost. So remember that pruning process? The less, these cells are activated, the more the brain says, well, I guess I don't need these. So it just gets pruned away. And again, here, in terms of marijuana and the size of the hippocampus, here, this is those who were regular users of marijuana on the left and right side of the brain, and those who were non-users. So again, you'll see that difference in the hippocampal volume. So, essentially this is saying that there's just less real estate in the brain to form memory and to learn with this exposure and fewer hippocampal cells. And then it's really important to understand that there is this link between marijuana and psychosis. So recently, the National Academies of Sciences did a really comprehensive review of the science on the effects of marijuana. And cannabinoids. And what they wanted to do was say, what's the strength of evidence of marijuana's risks and benefits? And what they found, or what they said, was that they found strong evidence for the link between marijuana and psychotic disorders. And one of the reasons for that is that today's marijuana is really different from the marijuana from 20 years ago. And it carries greater risks. So you may have heard that today's marijuana, in terms of the THC content, is much more potent than it was 20 years ago. So here's 1995 to 2014. This is the percent THC in the average cannabis plant sample that they tested, and this was almost 40,000 samples. And you could see that it's now almost 300% higher, more potent. The other thing that's happened is that there's another ingredient in the marijuana plant called cannabidiol, or CBD. CBD has been found to have antipsychotic properties. So it actually buffers the psychotic effects of THC. But the way that marijuana has been bred, it was bred to have higher THC, but not higher CBD. So that's one of the reasons why today's marijuana is more producing of psychosis than it used to. And today there's also this drive for much more potent THC products, including butane hash oil, which can contain up to 90% THC. That is really, really strong. And so as THC increases, we see more negative effects: paranoia, anxiety and panic, hallucinations, erratic mood swings, aggressive behavior. Those of us in children's hospitals, we're seeing a rapid increase in emergency room visits because of these kinds of adverse effects. This is the number of emergency room visits only because of marijuana, no other substance. And this was the first death in Colorado after recreational marijuana was legalized. This happened like 2 months after they officially started their recreational marijuana sales. This was a college student who was visiting Colorado on spring break, and he and his buddies in their hotel room had pot cookies. And he did not realize that you were supposed to eat 1/6 of the pot cookie. He ate the whole thing. He went psychotic and he jumped out the 4th floor window of the hotel to his death. So this is the kind of thing that we're seeing. And there's been a lot of attention on gun violence. Well, I would contend that more marijuana and more guns is really a lethal combination. So this was another young man that died in Colorado after recreational marijuana was legalized. This young man had his own gun. And during a psychotic episode, he was on vacation with his family skiing in Colorado. He ate 5 candies and shot himself to death. So, you know, marijuana is not harmless and really has to be carefully, people have to be carefully educated about this. Now, obviously, not everybody goes psychotic when they use marijuana, and it turns out there are specific genetic risks. So there are certain variants of certain genes that put people at much greater risk for developing psychosis if they're exposed to marijuana. So, for example, this particular gene variant, if somebody has that gene variant and they use marijuana daily, they have 7 times greater risk of psychosis. And so this is something to be aware of, that if there is in the family any family history of a mental health disorder, to be careful, because that might put you at risk for developing these issues. I also hear that marijuana is not addictive. Well, if it weren't addictive, this is the percent of substance abuse treatment admissions by drug for adolescents. The latest data that I have is 2014. This is alcohol, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine. That's the percent of adolescents who are in treatment, substance abuse treatment, because of marijuana, because they are not able to stop using. And one of the reasons is that there is, because of the higher THC, it's going to change the brain faster. And of course, for adolescents, it's going to change even faster than for adults. So what we're seeing is marijuana withdrawal symptoms of restlessness, anxiety, increased irritability, anger, and aggression, difficulty falling and staying asleep, boredom, and decreased appetite. So these things are often sometimes why people use marijuana, but it's kind of a vicious cycle because it'll actually exacerbate those problems over time. So, you know, this July, we're about to have this brave new world of legalized recreational marijuana. And, you know, potentially this is the next big tobacco, you know, the next big cash crop. And what we're concerned about, those of us in public health, is that those in the marijuana industry are using the same tactics that the tobacco industry used, including targeting youth, because then you have lifelong customers, right? If you create the addicted person in adolescence. Just as tobacco companies used candy cigarettes to kind of hook young people, and now tobacco companies have had to admit to those practices, those predatory practices. We also have these products, you know, that are marijuana edibles that really make it seem like it's perfectly, you know, safe or, you know, attractive. And the same thing with e-cigs. So there's a lot of marketing around e-cigs that have been designed to capture young people. And this is a quote from somebody from Lorillard, which is a major tobacco company. They said, kids may be particularly vulnerable to trying e-cigs due to an abundance of fun flavors such as cherry, vanilla, pina colada, and berry. Right? So they really are thinking about how to get young people to start. And these are just some e-juice flavors. And nicotine is obviously highly addictive. And advertising. So this says, weak people smoke, strong people smoke less, and intelligent people vape. And this has the use of the word organics, vape organics to try and make it seem like it's, you know, this natural thing. But the science is now finally coming out. This article was just published in the journal Pediatrics, which is one of the premier journals in my field. And this found teens inhale cancer-causing chemicals in e-cigs. What they found was that e-cig users had 3 times higher levels of these various chemicals, which are volatile organic compounds, some of which are cancer-causing. And these were found in the urine samples of e-cig users. For example, if you look up acrylonitrile, it says it's a highly poisonous compound used widely in the manufacture of plastics, adhesives, and synthetic rubber. So this is not the kind of thing that the e-cig manufacturers wanted people to know, right? So that's why, you know, it's important to get the science out there. So I'm going to just wrap up with this quote from John F. Kennedy. The future promise of any nation can be directly measured by the present prospects of its youth. As I mentioned, you are our future. We have no young lives to spare, okay? And alcohol and drugs are a major contributor to the deaths of young people, as I mentioned. So my recommendation from public health and healthcare is to avoid substance use until age 21 or older. Just as you probably don't want to do anything that would get into the way of your growing to the highest physical, you know, height that you could be, you know, try to preserve your ability to have the best brain that you can have for your future. Because we need you. We need your input, your leadership, your passion. It's been so inspiring to me watching, you know, young people really taking a stand and getting out there and saying this is important to us. And that's what we really want, what I want to be able to say to you is, you know, preserve your, you know, the best brain that you can have for your futures. So I will, at that point, end, and I will take questions. Thank you.